1. All right, we are live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, those who bounce in between. It is your friend Danky here with our good friend and comrade Tactical Spork here
Hello.
to talk to you all about what is going on with these protests. Now, I don't really think we need any sort of introduction to these. We all know what's going on. A few days ago, yet another unarmed black man named George Floyd was viciously murdered by cops. They pushed their knee down onto his neck for a total of, it was over 8 minutes long. Anyone who has seen the footage they know that there is no justification for this. There was no justification for the force used against George Floyd. Usually, and I remember previous cases where unarmed black men were killed by cops. They always, the cop defenders always come out and say, oh, well, the black person was doing something wrong. They were publicly intoxicated. They were selling untaxed cigarettes or something. It's always an excuse. Oh, they had a prior criminal record. Well, as is the case with George Floyd, well, first of all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. And secondly, they had him, the threat was neutralized, everyone. He was on the ground. He was in handcuffs. He posed zero threat to the officers. He posed zero threat to everyone around him. And yet they still saw fit to murder him in front of everyone. And so everyone is justified now taking to the streets and marching and protesting against police brutality. This has been a problem that's happened for decades now. And I remember hearing stories about my great grandpa. He was a police officer here in Memphis. And essentially, the story is that he could tell a black person to take himself down to the jailhouse, and they would do it, because the unspoken threat was that if you don't do it, Officer Chud is going to come after you and he's going to get you. So this was a tale that I had heard in my family for years and years, and it speaks to a trend that has been occurring probably forever in American history, of authorities, these police officers, stamping down on black people, treating them like second-class citizens. Comradical had this to say. He said, Louisville police killed a black man cooking food the other night. No body cams caught it, and a video released by them claims he was holding a gun. He was holding tongs as he cooked meat at his store. And this is an interesting trend that we see here. It is dangerous, ladies and gentlemen, to be a black person in the United States. It's dangerous. It doesn't matter if you are a law-abiding citizen, if you're on the up and up, if you're doing everything right. Like this guy. All he was doing, apparently, was holding some tongs, and he got shot. I don't even know what they accused George Floyd of doing. Was he publicly intoxicated?
What I think they were doing, well, I think he was a little bit intoxicated in some degree, but that's questionable. But I think the charge that they were arresting him for was, I guess, using a quote unquote counterfeit $20 bill, which I think ended up not being actually counterfeit. Wow. I think they just saw a black man who was maybe a little bit drunk or something, and they're just like, oh, better call the cops, better just call the state approved execution squad to roll in and deal with him by any means necessary to get him out of my store or whatever. I don't know. It's I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but the quote unquote charge that they brought against him was completely bullshit. 100%.
Right. And I mean, I'm sure that after your average NASCAR rally or something, there are plenty of white people who are stumbling out of the stadium absolutely drunk. Not the stadium, the racetrack. They're absolutely shit-faced drunk. They're probably destroying some property and stuff, but yet you don't see cops pushing white people down to the ground with their knee to their throat while the white person is begging that they can't breathe. And, you just don't see that. It is a extreme response to an issue that should have been handled with no violence, certainly no death. Hans Salavia put it great. He said it's a pig moment. Imagine shooting someone who feeds you.
Right. I mean, like, somebody in your Discord server posted this a few minutes ago, but I guess a store that was owned by like a black owner was getting looted, and the cops got called to the scene, and this is all on camera. The cops arrive at the scene, the looters have already fled, and the cops just arrest the store owners. They arrest the black store owners of the store that was being looted. They're just like, oh well, and there's like white people on the sidelines with cameras. They're like, no, those are the owners of the store. The looters went that way. And they're like, no, don't worry. We're arresting everyone at all the culprits. Don't worry about it. Don't interfere. And the white people are just screaming at them to like do anything to help. But they're just like, oh, black people have been apprehended. Case closed.
I'm a hero. It's like they give themselves a pat on the back. They're like, I'm such a hero. I've done such a great job protecting my community, serving my community. I'm gonna sleep well tonight, knowing that I arrested that evil store owner.
Yeah, I mean, like, so there was, I think one of the reasons why we were doing this was, I think on our Iron Curtain video, our most recent Iron Curtain video, we got a comment from somebody. Let me see if I can just quickly bring it up. Somebody was basically saying, if I can find it, they said, Iron Curtain podcast, please respond to this. George Floyd's death was unjustful, and it's true that racism needs to be addressed in this country. Peaceful protesting should be utilized. However, it's unfortunate to see so many fellow MLs blindly supporting all rioting and looting done by destructive protesters. It's as if most MLs are frothing to see violence and action against the current power structure, just like the anarchists. Until we are ready for a socialist revolution, then it is in no Marxist revolutionary's interest to support the destruction we're currently seeing. Too much self-damage is being done against fellow proletarians by these protesters every night when escalation, inevitable, occurs. Do we not remember Lenin's view on revolutionary spontaneism? Class consciousness isn't widespread enough. There is no ideological forefront or grounding to these protests. There is no organization. This is a spearhead with no shaft. It will cause a lot of damage, but it will not reach its target. It should not be supported beyond purely peaceful protesting. The rioting, looting, and violence must be condemned at the juncture. So, I mean, I think we can all agree, probably the people who are watching this, I'll probably all agree that George Floyd's death was just horrible. But I think a lot of the contention now is with the rioting and the protesting that's going on. So I was wondering what your thoughts on this person's kind of comment is, and then maybe I could give my take on it.
Right. Well, I can't speak for the protests going on elsewhere in other cities, but here in Memphis, the protests have been nonviolent, and the organizers are committed to that. I witnessed no looting, no property destruction, nothing like that. But what the media does, what our local media has done, WREG, News Channel 3, they will phrase it like this. They'll say there were protests happening in the downtown metro area. Looting and rioting also occurred. So take note on how they phrase this. They will phrase it in the same sentence. Protesters, oh yeah, and there are also looters and rioters. And so it is through this wordplay, this clever wordplay, that people are now reading the mainstream media and they are associating these legitimate protests with looters and rioters. And this is something that the bourgeois media is trying to do very successfully. And, like I mentioned in the past, whenever a black person dies, there's usually, from the conservatives, this blame game going on. Oh, well, they were wearing a hoodie. They looked like a thug. Oh, they were selling untaxed cigarettes. Oh, they had a fake $20 bill. There's always some excuse. But now, I think even the most brainwashed of conservative would agree that there was no excuse for George Floyd's death. And so the only ammunition they have to shoot back at the protesters at this point is by associating them at every single turn with looters and with rioters. I
Right.
think this is being done intentionally, and it's successful. A lot of people think that these protests have no legitimacy, that it's just being used as an excuse to loot and riot. And this is because the bourgeois media is perpetuating this myth.
Yeah.
President Trump is perpetuating this myth.
And this happens every single time there's a protest too. Like rioting is and looting is pretty much inevitable. And like you can't have a serious demonstration without it. And if you're going to condemn every single protest that has rioting or looting in it, like that's basically saying that you don't think that there should be protests.
Right.
Because like they all have, like it's just a part of it. It's not really like something you can do without. I mean, there's a really good article that I saw. It is called "In Defense of Looting" by Vicky Osterweil, and I thought it made some really good points. These are just a few quotes from it that I found on Twitter, but I read the whole article. But I thought it was so good. So they say looting is extremely dangerous to the rich and most white people because it reveals, with an immediacy that has to be moralized away, that the idea of private property is just that, an idea, a tenuous and contingent structure of consent, backed up by the lethal force of the state. When rioters take territory and loot, they're revealing precisely how, in a space without cops, property relations can be destroyed and things can be had for free. White people deploy the idea of looting in a way that implies people of color are greedy and lazy, but it is just the opposite. Looting is a hard-won and dangerous act with potentially terrible consequences, and looters are only stealing from the rich owners' profit margins. Those owners, meanwhile, especially if they own a chain like Quick Trip, this was written back when the Ferguson riots were going on, and I guess Quick Trip was like a big store that got looted. Those chains steal 40 hours every week from thousands of employees who in return get the privilege of not dying for another 7 days. So that's part of it. But I wanted to kind of address part of the person's comment that they left where they said, where was it? Too much self-damage is being done against fellow proletarians by these protesters every night while the escalation occurs. So I just like, we have to think to ourselves, like, what kind of stores are being looted and damaged in these protests? I mean, these are mostly happening in like low income, impoverished neighborhoods. And the stores that are being attacked are not like mom and pop stores owned by like black people in these communities. They are largely corporate stores and oftentimes industries that kind of profit off of these and kind of leech off of these communities. So like you have like credit loan places that kind of basically work by getting people into predatory debt that like basically destroys their ability to kind of save money or invest in anything or really kind of get ahead. They're always basically kept in a cycle of debt. You have like fast food restaurants. I mean, those fast food restaurants are insured. All of these places are insured pretty much. Like any kind of damage that's being done is trivial to these multinational corporations. Like that is not really the issue. Proletarians are not damaging proletarians at all in this situation. There's no working class people fighting each other. Like looting, there's not a distinction between rioting or protesting and looting. They're both political actions. And like if the state the capitalist state exists to protect property. And the capitalist state doesn't give a fuck if you're out in the street holding up a sign. That doesn't threaten its hold on power. What it actually cares about is protecting property, and it will take actions to protect property. It won't take actions to protect Black people's lives at all. So I just thought this made really good points. And so, kind of to continue with the last part, it says, when in the midst of an anti-police protest movement, people loot, they aren't acting non-politically, like I said. They aren't distracting from the issue of police violence and domination, nor are they fanning the flames of an always already racist media discourse. Instead, they're getting straight to the heart of the problem of the police, property, and white supremacy. So I think this article basically said it as best as I could, better than I ever could. So curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah. And I think even if these looters were part of the Black Lives Matter protests, I think the protest organizers obviously don't intend on looting and rioting to be one of the main ways by which we protest police brutality. And in fact, in the cases that we've seen, Soviet winter prison correctly points this out. There's a probability that police are infiltrating the protests and causing damage. We've seen several examples of police posing as protesters. Now, I know, I think this was in Milwaukee, but someone smashed the windows of an AutoZone in Milwaukee. Well, the person who smashed the windows was a cop. The protesters were following them and rightfully calling them out as being a cop. I know here in Memphis, our local organizer, Devontae Hill, was exposed as collaborating with the Memphis Police Department. So we can't be ignorant about this. We have to understand that there are agent provocateurs from the highest levels of this protests to down to the lowest levels. And if everyone is on the up and up and no one is looting and no one is rioting, well, the police will send in someone disguised as a protester who will loot, who will riot, who will try to charge the barricades. And it is only through luck and through discipline that this hasn't really happened yet in Memphis. But as we've seen from numerous reports, this is happening in other cities. Andreas Sommerfeld asked me, what's my view on direct action in those protests and what can others do to alleviate some pain from the communities? I think one of the most important things that you can do right now to show your solidarity is to go to these protests. Now, if you are immune compromised, if you're at risk, obviously don't put yourself at risk. But in the protest I went to, there was the main crowd, but there were also places off to the side and further back where if you wanted to social distance, you could hang back a little bit and you didn't have to go up in the thick of the crowd. I live with two immune compromised people, so I had to take extra precautions. And when I went to the protest, I had to make extra sure that I wasn't touching anyone and that I was trying my best to stay as far away from the crowd as possible. But
Right.
as far as what you can do, first of all, even if you can't be at these protests physically, offering your support online, offering your voice online, if you have a family member who is talking shit about these protesters, correct them. Now is not the time to have decorum. Now is not the time to be polite. Now is the time to call out your racist family members for their racist reactionary views. And, you might turn into the black sheep of the family, but at least you know where you stand and at least you took a stand. And that's the important thing. A lot of people in my family don't like these protests. I'm pretty much the odd duck out, or the ugly duckling, as it were. But, that's not going to stop me from supporting something that I know is absolutely right. And it's literally the least I could do. As a white person, supporting these protests is the least I could do.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you can do, even if you're off to the side of a protest, is just whip your phone out, open up the camera app, and just fucking film everything. Like, you never know when something is just going to happen spontaneously. Some cop just decides to, pull out a rubber bullet gun, shoot someone, or, crack someone over the skull or something like that. Like, all of that video evidence is immensely helpful to, if something does go down, to kind of holding these cops accountable in some way. I mean, obviously it's not guaranteed because, they're protected by every aspect of the state, but like it can definitely help in some degree. One thing I would say is if you are recording stuff in a protest, do not release any footage online or on your Instagram or whatever, or on YouTube. Do not post any video or photos of people in an identifiable way doing any sort of illegal activities. All right. I know that like it's very tempting to just kind of like show off and, show yourself being a badass or show like really cool riot footage and things like that for the likes and the social cred. But the police use that evidence, and even if it's just somebody in the background doing something like spray painting a wall or something like that, they can use that against people, and they will use that against people if they have it. I mean, that's evidence for them. So use it. So capture as much footage as you can, but if you have to release stuff online, only release stuff that is incriminating to the cops. Do not incriminate your fellow protesters.
Right. And take care, like Tactical Sports said, take care not to show anyone's face. Now, I went 2 days ago to the protest here in Memphis and I got a ton of footage, but there's a lot of it I can't use because it shows people spray painting, and there are also clips that show people's faces. Now, most people there were wearing a mask, but you have to take care and you have to be on the lookout. And please don't dox your fellow comrades, your fellow activists, just because you want social media points. It's not worth it. It's not worth doxing your fellow activists. So I am taking extra meticulous care to ensure that any videos or footage I upload of the protest isn't showing people committing illegal acts, and it is not doxing people, because the police, they won't just look at someone's face. They'll look at their gait, their posture. They will look at their hair. They will look at the clothing that they have on.
Right.
So yeah, take extra care. Now, I noticed there is somebody in the comments here leaving some stuff like this. This seems to be a long-winded way to excuse the criminal nature of minorities, to be honest. Now, what are you doing here, dude? Post Nazbol Judaism.
Yeah.
Get
Come on, dude. Get out of here.
Jesus chud. Why don't you go back and read the bell curve a few more times?
Yeah, that's pretty cringe. I mean, how can you be like, ugh, just get out of here, dude.
Guy, just look at him. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's in your Discord. I think you might want to kick him or something like that.
Yeah. Well, you have revealed yourself, post Nazbol Judaism. You have revealed yourself.
Yeah. If it was ironic, we might give it a pass, but I mean, come on, dude. Like, educate yourself. Like, minorities are human beings just like you. And
no, they have a criminal nature.
Ugh, yeah. I mean, think about it like this, dude. I mean, throughout history, wherever there's poverty, no matter what the race is, there's been an increase in criminal activity in impoverished communities, right? Look back in history at, like, Irish slums in the early 1900s. You know, Italians were once seen as criminals and, you know, drains on society. You know, whiteness itself is a social construct that changes all the time. Irish people, Italian people didn't used to be regarded as white, but then that changes. And now all of a sudden, oh, they're no longer criminals. They're upstanding members of the community. So just don't get fucking drawn into that shit. Okay? You're being played for a fool by reactionaries who are trying to divert working class people against each other and getting them to hate each other rather than hating the actual cause of the issue. So just please, dude. That's all I'm going to say.
Um, oh yeah, Andreas Sommerfeld has another comment. He says, "Hey Danky, thank you for answering my question. What is going to happen when the military finally comes for the crowd, like Donald Trump said?" I think a few things could happen. We have already seen the cops using rubber bullets and tear gas. Now we have to talk about tear gas, and we have to talk about the Geneva Convention. It's a violation of Geneva Convention protocols to use chemical weapons in warfare. But there is no such protocol for using these weapons on your own people. That is exactly what tear gas is, ladies and gentlemen. It is a chemical weapon that is banned in warfare. So why in the world is it considered humane or lawful to use chemical weapons on your own civilians, on your own population? Keep in mind, a few years prior to this, Trump was calling out Assad in Syria for using, supposedly, using chemical weapons against his own people. So, should we not hold Trump to the same standard? And what I think is more telling is that Trump threatened to send the dogs after these protesters. Now, we all know back during the civil rights struggle, attack dogs were released by reactionaries to attack the black protesters and black activists. It was not even a dog whistle. It was just a normal whistle, just like when Trump said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen." That was, you know, a whistle, a loud whistle, an air horn to all the white supremacists, all the Nazis, neo-Nazis, and they have taken cues from the president. And so now you have white supremacist groups all around the country essentially gearing up for an imminent race war. You have white supremacist groups like Identity Europa making fake Antifa accounts saying, "All right, comrades, we're going to go into the white neighborhoods and kill everyone," you know, because that's how Antifa speaks.
How do
Let's
you
see.
do, fellow Antifa? Yeah.
Yeah. Soviet Winter Prison says, what's telling the right wingers saying to shoot the protesters? Been a large number of people pushing very dangerous rhetoric, like President Chud. I am hoping that cooler heads will prevail, but knowing President Trump, knowing his record, knowing how stupid he is, cooler heads aren't going to prevail. Okay, Trump had an opportunity to try to damage control this. He could have come out immediately after George Floyd was murdered and said, "Look, we are working on a national response. It's going to be tremendous. It's going to be stupendous. We are going to do national police reform. And what happened to George Floyd, it'll never happen to anyone again. Believe me." That's all Trump had to say. But instead, he came out, you know, his balls swinging, and he says, you know, "Oh, we're going to send in the troops. We're going to shoot all of you. You're a bunch of thugs. We're going to send the dogs after you." You know, that is the Trump response. He has directly escalated this situation, just like he escalated the coronavirus situation. And, you know, folks have asked me, like, why are the protests happening now? And I think it's because it's happening within the context of an economic collapse Capitalism's collapsing once again, and we are also seeing a global pandemic. And the US's response to which has been absolutely abysmal. We have over 100,000 people dead. And so I think in this context, America is already a powder keg. And the murder of George Floyd has been the thing that has lit the powder keg.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the fact that like there's like something like 25% unemployment right now, I mean, that's absolutely accelerating this to a level that we definitely wouldn't have seen. I think people just generally just don't have very much to lose at the moment. They they like when people are hungry and they're angry and they don't really have anywhere else to go, they will show up in the street. Like history shows that this is like how revolutionary situations come about. You know, like it's one thing to just spread, you know, communist propaganda or ideology everywhere, but if people's material conditions are not putting them in a revolutionary mindset, you'll only get so far. But once the conditions are in place, like they are right now, you see people are so much more open to reevaluating things that they thought they would never change their minds about. So it's pretty amazing.
Right. And you are also, it's also interesting to compare the government's response to the anti-lockdown protesters with the current response to the Black Lives Matter protesters. About a month ago, feels like a long time ago, but about a month ago, there were protesters all over the country, mostly white conservatives, who wanted to reopen the country. I don't want to wear my mask. I want to go get a hamburger. I want to go get a haircut. It's these same people who have like a doomsday prepper dungeon in their house. They've got like 9 AR-15s, Kevlar vests, enough canned beans to last them years in the event of an apocalypse. They got like the doomsday shelter in the backyard, but yet these snowflakes couldn't last a couple months without going stir crazy. And these protesters in Michigan charged a courthouse. They infiltrated a courthouse, and they were all fully armed. They were armed to the teeth. And not only were they not shot at or tear gassed, but they also weren't arrested. So, meanwhile, over here in Memphis, you have black people protesting against police brutality. And we had pretty much every single cop in Memphis on the scene, all up and down the interstate. In the footage that I'll post probably later today, you can see just the sheer number of cop cars. They also had state troopers from outside the city and the National Guard. And, as of yesterday, they also had the military. So you see how the cops come out in droves. You see how the state apparatus comes out in droves to stop a protest of black people. But there's absolute crickets when it comes to armed white protesters storming a courthouse building. I think the hypocrisy with those two responses speaks for itself. It tells you everything you've got to know.
Oh yeah, I mean, like one thing that I saw recently that was just amazing was, I mean, so much has been said about the Hong Kong protests that have been happening since like September of last year or something like that. Or it's been almost a full year since those protests started. In that time, they've committed 9,000 arrests, the Hong Kong police. There have been 2 deaths, which were actually both from the protesters. I think one, like an old man was sweeping the street. He got hit by a brick by a protester, and I think somebody else got like stabbed or like lit on fire by protesters. But then the US, we've had protests going on for 3 days. Okay, 3 days, not even a full week, not even half a week. And we've had 5,000 arrests so far in 3 days, and we've had 8 deaths in just these past few days, not even including the people who have been killed that sparked these protests, which was like almost like one a day in the past couple of weeks. Like it seems like every day another black person has been getting killed by a police in the past couple of weeks. So like it's just like which the United States wants to convince you that what's going on in Hong Kong is, you know, brutal crackdown by the state, authoritarian, blah blah blah. Like, come on, y'all. Like seriously, this is just ridiculous. Like 3 days, all this has happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it is funny to see how President Trump apparently cares so much about the Hong Kong protesters, but yet when there's real, actual protests in his backyard, he's like, "No, we're sending in the dogs. You're a bunch of thugs."
Yeah, he was like, Xi Jinping needs to go meet with these protesters and talk to them. Meanwhile, like one day into the protests, the Trump just like goes and hides in his bunker and turns off all the lights in the White House. Like, oh, guys, I'm not home anymore. You can leave.
I
Like, yeah.
I think President Xi needs to go on Chinese media and say, "You know what? These brave Black Lives Matter protesters, they're fighting for democracy. We
They
need to
did.
them."
The one of the like ambassadors, Chinese ambassadors, came on like their TV, and he was like, "Oh, like the U.S. like needs to protect the rights of its black minority, and like Black Lives Matter." Like I think he literally said like Black Lives Matter. Like the United States needs to like, you know, safeguard the rights of these people. So like, yeah, they're on that.
I mean, to quote the Lord, he gave a parable one time about how, there were two brothers, and one brother wanted to help the other one build a house, but he had a little problem. He had a plank of wood that was lodged in his eye, and so Jesus said, before you remove the speck of wood that's in your brother's eye, you need to pull the plank out of your own eye. And it's the exact same situation here in America. We don't need to be looking to Hong Kong trying to meddle in China's affairs when we have national protest in every major city, calling for an end to systemic racism, calling for an end to police brutality. Not only do our cries go ignored by the president, but he directly antagonizes us. He directly antagonizes the black community. He has zero sympathy for our cause, and yet, somehow Western leftists have convinced themselves to, care about the Hong Kong protests. The Western media has convinced us to somehow care about the Hong Kong protests and not not our own protest happening in our backyard.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, you got to be thinking about your own struggle. I mean, other countries' struggle is important, but like as Americans, we're in the belly of the beast, and our responsibility is to be ruthlessly criticizing our own government first and foremost before you do anything else. Because let's be honest, like Americans do not understand other countries. We just are not educated on them. And unless you do like a lot of work to understand the history of other countries and their struggle and all of that, you should probably, no investigation, no right to speak, basically.
Oh man, we got another big brain
Oh
comment.
boy.
China's ethnically homogenous. Wrong.
Hey,
Wrong. You failed.
we got to get this guy out of here.
You failed the grade. Yeah. Just, dude.
China is not ethnically homogenous. It has like hundreds of ethnic groups inside of it. You doofus. All right. Please stop. Just get out of here, dude. Like, is it possible to block people on YouTube? I don't even know. But I don't know. Like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, he says we're just two pasty white guys virtue signaling. Yeah, well, that's better.
I'd rather virtue signal than be a fucking bigot and a racist ass piece of shit who doesn't know anything about any other country. He doesn't even know about his own country. So just, dude, get out of here.
So going back, going back to what is happening here in the United States, you see this vastly disproportional response when There are conservative white protesters when they're armed to the teeth, charging not a courthouse but a Capitol building, as a commenter, Jeremy Sullivan, correctly pointed out. They intimidated the state legislature into closing, and according to Hansalavia, they lit someone on fire. But no arrests, no shots fired, no tear gas canisters launched. But the second that black people take to the streets to demand cops stop killing them, all of a sudden it's like every pig in Memphis came on the scene. They had
never see 3%ers and like small government libertarians arguing that the government should stop, cracking down brutally on black communities. Suddenly they're not really worried about big government oppressiveness when that's happening.
Right. It's like, all right, boys and girls, we're going to lock and load and we're going to fight off the tyranny. But the second the tyranny attacks black people, they just start whistling into the wind. They don't care.
Taxes increased by 3%. Oh man, like the brutal government is oppressing me. Police murder, a black person every day for like 2 weeks. Oh, well, these people don't know. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't have any idea. They just want to go out in the street for no reason.
Right. The phrasing of white conservative protesters as patriots exercising their free speech, where black protesters are violent, they're thugs, they're looters, they're rioters. This is something that Western propaganda does, time and time again. The U.S. media has consistently smeared Black Lives Matter protesters as being these chaotic, violent, disorganized mob, whereas American or conservative protests, they are all American. They are patriotic. They are exercising their free speech. It's just like the Boston Tea Party. So, right. Yeah, I mean, you see this discrepancy in a response. And you also see that Trump is trying to label Antifa a terrorist organization. And a lot of people, they see that and they laugh because obviously Antifa is not like a club that you join. It's not like a political party. We don't have like cards. We're not like card carrying members of Antifa. I don't go to the Antifa secret council meeting. So Trump saying that he is declaring Antifa a terrorist organization, this is just carte blanche. He is giving carte blanche for the cops, for the FBI, and all other members of the state apparatus to prosecute activists, to prosecute socialists, to prosecute communists. This is in many ways resembling the Palmer raids, the first and second Red Scare. You are going to start, mark my words, you're going to start seeing Republicans and right-wingers calling out Democratic politicians as being Antifa sympathizers.
Oh my God.
You already sort of see this dog whistle. Trump labeled the mayor of Minneapolis as a far-left sympathizer. So you already see this trend.
Yeah, I mean, like literally just giving, vague platitudes and sympathetic gestures towards the protesters is, I guess, like makes you like a far left radical terrorist in his eyes. So, I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Like he's intentionally, like Trump knows that Antifa is not like a political organization that people can join. It's just a tactic. It's like an idea. It's like a way of thinking about things, but it's not like a concrete thing. So, yeah, I mean, not exactly. No, we do not condone that at all.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know where these like fake leftist accounts are, coming out. Maybe this dude's joking around. I hope this guy's joking around.
Yeah. Well, we're advocating for peaceful change. Like we're not advocating that anybody goes out and does anything violent or illegal. Just to be clear. So, anyways, Yeah, but the thing about Antifa is they know that it's a completely vague and meaningless thing, so that they can pin anybody that they don't like as being a part of it. That's what they did during the Red Scare. It doesn't matter if you were a member of this Communist Party. They would designate you a fellow traveler, quote unquote, and
Right.
they would prosecute you just the same for what you believed in, because it wasn't about getting rid of people in a particular party. It was just getting rid of dissent in general.
Is that where Fellow Traveler got his username from?
I believe so. I mean, that's where I think the term came from. Like
Nice.
people who weren't explicitly in the party, but were like sympathetic to it, aka like anybody left wing.
I got my username from I think it was a game of Jeopardy. They tried to ask him like what this video game was, and someone answered Danky Kang. Yeah, very very interesting story. A little bit unrelated. Somebody asked me what's my favorite Donkey Kong game. It's Donkey Kong Country 2. Dixie Kong's Quest. It's the best game ever made. But anyway, oh okay. Auto Bolshevik was memeing. Good. Thank you.
Oh yes, awesome. Good to see.
The Nazbol dude threw us off. So now I don't know what to believe anymore.
Right.
My mind has been tampered with. My feelings have been tampered with. Love you, Danky. I love you too. Thank you very much. thank
very
you.
Cool profile picture too. Very fun.
What is this? It's Shrek, Wreck-It Ralph. He's got like Buzz Lightyear wings and
he's got Wally treads.
This is what capitalism fears the most.
Oh, and Jimmy Neutron hair. Can't forget that.
It's amazing.
Very fun. I approve.
Unfortunately for Nazbol Jucheism, he's 100% serious. So, sorry everybody. There are people out there that are literally like this.
All right, dude. I don't even know what to say. I mean, you probably think that we're just like, soft triggered SJWs or something like that. But like, I think you just really need to kind of be a lot more open-minded and reevaluate a lot of the shit that you believe, because it's pretty fucking reactionary and horrible.
Yeah.
Think about it. Like, you basically hate like the vast majority of humanity, and maybe you consider yourself to be a socialist, but that's about as far from socialism as you can be. That's pretty horrible. It's a horrible way to look at the world and to look at other people. I don't think that's a controversial thing, and I don't think it's a soft lefty thing to believe. We're all looking out for each other. We're all proletarians, and we need to have each other's backs rather than hating each other.
He says he's stronger than us. Okay. Well, prove us wrong. Start making some videos. How about you, get up off your armchair and go to these protests and actually do something instead of just sitting by calling other leftist YouTubers like liberals or something. You say we're infected with liberalism and it ties you down. Yeah, well, at least we're not infected with racism like you.
I don't understand how being racist makes you further to the left than...
Yeah.
I just don't get it. Honestly, maybe I'm too corrupted with liberalism to understand your enlightened philosophy, but like, yeah, I don't think reading Mein Kampf or whatever you're reading is really going to do me any good.
Now, as for a comment with actual substance, Andreas Sommerfeld says, I think communist organizations should join together and help organize these Floyd protests. Now, here in Memphis, PCUSA has been there. Party of Socialism and Liberation has been there. I saw someone carrying an IWW banner. So there are communist, socialist, communist-leaning groups that are coming out and helping these protests and supporting these protests. Lenin wrote extensively in What Is to Be Done about spontaneity and bowing to spontaneity. And he says that, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but in short, a communist party shouldn't allow themselves to be led by the masses, but at the same time, they can't go too far ahead of the masses. And I was wondering, Tactical Spork, if you'd maybe want to elaborate a little bit on what Lenin was trying to say there.
Yeah. So, I mean, what he says is like there's a difference between spontaneity and spontaneity. And I mean, that's kind of confusing, but like basically, it's like an engine. Like spontaneity, as in what we're seeing now with protests, is good because it kicks things off and it's like a spark plug or whatever that kind of gets things going and triggers the kind of fuel to combust and gets things pushing forward. But you can't just have that initial spark without anything else, without the rest of the motor, right? Because that spark will just fizzle out and nothing will happen. But you need organization, which is kind of pushed forward by that kind of initial spark and get the motor running, because people cannot be protesting like this all the time. Like, it's just not sustainable. It's going to burn itself out very quickly. But the whole purpose of an organization is basically to channel that energy and keep that momentum going, albeit on a lower level, into the future, right? Like, keep it going even when people aren't like super, filled with anger and passion and all that kind of stuff. It's still working towards kind of a certain goal in a concrete way. And then as more and more spontaneous things happen, the whole idea of an organization is to magnify the effect of that organization. So like with the Bolsheviks, there were protests all through early 1900s. 1905, there was a big protest that got put down when a whole bunch of people got shot on Bloody Sunday, a whole bunch of peaceful protesters. But the reason why those protests didn't just get burned out and everyone went home and forgot about it was because there was a solid organization network that basically, even after these protests were done, after all these strikes went through, they were still out there building and building and building, so that when World War I arrived and a huge crisis happened, all of a sudden there was the framework in place that they could use to channel all of that anger against the war into revolutionary, energy. So that's basically the kind of the theory behind it. And I think it makes a lot of sense. So there's spontaneity, which is by itself, not very helpful. And then there's spontaneity in an organized sense that you can use and harness.
Right. That, I think is a very good point. And here, the Black Lives Matter protests are not led by socialists. They're not led by communists. They are led, from what I have seen, by an individual who is associated with the MPD. Now, the protest has changed leadership, organizational leadership. So that person is no longer at the head of the organizing. But it just goes to show how if these spontaneous protests aren't led by socialists or by communists, by comrades, they will be led by liberals. They will be led by reactionaries. And that leadership will reflect on that protest's ability to actually get change done. So it's also important to realize that this is a Black Lives Matter protest. And so I don't really think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it is the role for white socialists to step in and say, you're not being woke enough, you need to do this and that and the other thing. I think the role for white socialists would be to find Black socialists and to empower them, to help them take command.
I agree.
Yeah, to help train a new generation of Black socialist leaders for this movement, I think would be an objective that the PCUSA and other communist groups need to do, first and foremost, rather than try to take over the movement and have white people at the helm. I think that's a very problematic approach. So yeah, me and Tactical Spork were pretty much on the same page. You need to educate Black working class individuals. You need to get them class conscious, and you need to empower Black leadership.
Yeah, I mean, already we're seeing a lot of these protest movements being co-opted by liberals and opportunists. Uh, you'll see, like, if you go on Reddit, it's all just like people basically fawning over, like, quote unquote, like the good police,
Right.
all that kind of stuff. People are like, oh, wow, so inspiring. You know, this police officer didn't kill this guy. Amazing. Like, wow, police are great. Like, don't believe that stuff. But, like, that's an active force that we need to kind of be resisting all the time. But yeah, I totally agree. Like, if you go into like a protest or whatever, and you're just basically trying to like be a, you know, salesman for your party or something like that, and you're trying to like criticize everybody for not being like real enough, like that's the easiest way to get people to just kind of like disregard you or just think you're weird. You know, like this is about their struggle. Like you need to keep, like, it's important to keep them on track and not just like get co-opted by
Right.
like complete liberalism. But it's also like it's not your, if you're just a white person, like you shouldn't be telling black people that they're like not protesting correctly or something like that.
But
Um
yeah, because that's something that, white liberals will always do. They did this with Black Lives Matter in the past. When Black Lives Matter first started, they said, "Oh, tisk tisk, I'm going to wag my finger at these black protesters and critique the way that they go about doing things." Well, I'm sorry, but your community, the white community, isn't the one that's being constantly harassed by cops every single day. Uh, it wasn't a white person who had their a cop's knee pressed to their throat and was brutally murdered in front of everyone. It was an unarmed black man, and it seems to be the trend. So this subsequent trend of white liberals criticizing black protesters has got to stop. Um, but we've got some more comments. The only reason why I keep bringing this up is because I feel like the sentiments that this person is expressing are ones that are common enough and warrant a response to. So he says the irony of these dudes claiming racism is bad, but I can guarantee the anti-white racism in them is monumental. Now, this
what
is funny considering that I'm a white guy.
what
Um,
have we said that indicates anti-white racism? I have not said anything bad against white people at
this,
all.
if I'm not a betting man, but if I had to bet money, I would say this person is a Nazi in disguise because they said the criminal nature of minorities and just other weird phrases like this. Um, anti-white racism. Are you kidding me? Now, okay. Uh, this is an interesting question. Is reverse racism real? I would say in the most mundane sense, it can be, but when we are talking about racism, we're talking about more than just microaggressions. We're talking about more than just um, dirty looks from white people. We are talking about black people, unarmed black people being killed by police. We are talking about black people, even though they use drugs at the same rates that whites do, they're much more likely to get arrested for it. They're much more likely to get a criminal record, which here in the state of Tennessee, several other states across the U.S., if you have a felony record, that means you can't vote. And if you can't vote, you're politically disenfranchised. Also, there's the issue of prison labor, private prisons, and the incentivization that the cops use to go after black people, the war on drugs, how it disproportionately targets people of color. So there are all sorts of issues that plague the black community uniquely that white people simply don't have to deal with. So when you're talking about anti-white racism, right, you're not talking about a prison system that is set up against you. You're not talking about a police system that is set up against you, an educational system that is set up against you. You're not talking about essentially a new Jim Crow, a new form of slavery. Um,
Yeah, I'm curious when this guy thinks that like the tables switched. Like, okay, so you have slavery, you have hundreds of years, like over 100 years of Jim Crow laws being put into effect to systematically deny black people from owning property, from breaking black families apart, um, criminalizing basically everything, like vagrancy laws, like basically just forbidding black people from like existing in public areas, giving them subpar education, subpar, you know, housing. Um, look up, dude, look up Black Wall Street. Okay, there was
Yeah.
a, I don't know if you've heard of this, Danky. There was a relatively successful black neighborhood. I think it was somewhere in like the Midwest, but it was called Black Wall Street because there were a whole bunch of successful African American entrepreneurs who basically created like a thriving village or a thriving town that had its own kind of self-sustaining economy and things like that. They were doing really well, but that was intolerable to the white majority of their state. And like some little thing sparked it off, and there was just a massive, just, they basically burned down the entire place. They destroyed, like, they killed, you know, I don't know how many black people in that area. They literally bombed it with planes
Right.
and burned down the entire place. And the whole area has never recovered from that point. So, like, you go through all of that. Plus, in the 80s, like Danky was saying, the drug war on drugs that broke black families apart, destroyed their neighborhoods, got them, you know, addicted to like crack intentionally. If you look into that, like the CIA and FBI were involved in distributing crack in black neighborhoods to basically destroy them. Systematic destruction of the Black Panther Party, for basically handing out free lunches and free breakfasts to kids.
How dare they? Free breakfasts. That sounds like some communist stuff right there.
And like constant police surveillance of black neighborhoods leading up to today. So at what point, what year do you think the tables switched and all of that basically got flipped on its head? And now I guess black people are now oppressing you or something like that on the same scale. Now it's just, it's, you know, the tables have turned, right? Like at what year? 2000, 2005? You think that that's like the turning point or something like that, where all of a sudden they're in command?
It
Like,
was
give
when
me
a
a fucking break, dude. Come on. Educate yourself on history and don't just read a bunch of racist nonsense.
Black Wall Street. I believe that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But he also dropped this one. He says, by focusing on liberal identity politics, you shoot yourself in the foot. Now, I think there is a distinguishment to be made between, you know, what you could call liberal identity politics and socialist identity politics. When liberals talk about identity politics, it's very much, you know, kumbaya, let's all join hands, you know, as one. Let's, oh, what was that Pepsi commercial that came out a few years ago where it showed like protesters coming?
Yeah, with like Kylie Jenner or something coming out, and she just drinks the Pepsi, and then all the protests, like everyone cheers and claps and stuff because
Exactly.
like we've been united by the power of Pepsi. Yeah, like, okay, liberal identity politics is when you exclusively focus on identity issues and completely disregard class politics. So that's like Forbes being like, "Oh wow, there's like 5 more black billionaires this year than there were before." Like basically praising superficial identity politics issues at the complete expense of you know, any kind of class struggle, right? We should oppose that because obviously it's leaving out a huge part of the picture, right? And it's not doing really anybody any good except for like the 5 black billionaires that are on like the Forbes list or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
we should not be, you know, celebrating that. We should say, no, there shouldn't be any billionaires because capitalism is terrible and we need to combat capitalism in any way that we can. But if we can't be like this guy, where for some reason he thinks that even just mentioning racism, even just talking about racial issues, talking about issues, you know, gender issues, you know, fighting for the rights of gay people, trans people, you know, all kinds of other minorities and, marginalized groups, just mentioning them, even acknowledging their existence is, I guess, distracting from the class struggle. No, you can do both. You can fight for those people's rights and advocate for class struggle. Like, how is that so hard to understand, my dude?
Yeah.
Please. Like, like you really think that like in the 80s, like socialists and communists shouldn't have been fighting for gay people's rights, or like fighting against like the government's ignorance of the AIDS crisis, because like, oh, that's identity politics, they should just be focusing on class issues. No, just do both. Like they did both. And now, like, yes, I mean, the LGBT movement has been somewhat, you know, utilized by corporations and stuff to sell their things. Obviously, that's not great, but
Right.
it's much better to be a gay person or a trans person. I mean, obviously, there's still so much more that we can do to help those communities. But like, do you really think that the whole gay rights movement just shouldn't have happened or something because it's not class focused? Okay, come on, dude, please, just like you're like people like that guy, that Nazbol guy or whatever, like they're the ones who are focused on identity politics way more because they hate it. Like if you just take all of the energy that you spend complaining about identity politics and do something useful with it, because you're really the one who's focusing on it in an actually counterproductive and bigoted and horrible way.
Yeah. He also had this to say. He said, by saying to empower black leadership, you're pushing for nationalism within the struggles.
Dude, you're literally fucking advocating for ethno states. Like you're literally advocating for like I don't even know, like getting all minorities out of the country or something, like, and somehow saying that we should have more black leadership in socialist groups is being nationalist. Come on, man.
I mean, there was a position that the USSR had. I think this was in the 30s, but it was basically like the black belt, the sector of the population called the black belt here in the US had a right to self-determination. And I think the black population is a little bit too dispersed in the United States now to really call for that kind of thing. But at the same time, the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement needs to consist of black people. And by educating and empowering black people to take on leadership roles within that movement, that's not a bad thing. So I really don't understand what this person wants us to do. Would you rather white people run Black Lives Matter? Because I can tell you right now, the optics of that don't look good at all.
Yeah. I mean, what else can we really say? I mean, I don't think we're going to get through this guy. So let's actually maybe focus on some questions from people who have thoughtful and interesting kind of questions to ask.
Right. So, Matthew Chaikin pointed out liberals will virtue signal and not do jack shit when it comes to solving racism. And I think where we are distinguished from that is that we are calling out racism. We are pointing out how horrible American society has treated black people, but we are proposing solutions, solutions to stop police brutality, solutions to stop systemic discrimination. We aren't telling you, oh, hop the barricade and give them a Pepsi, and that'll solve everything. That is the difference.
The liberal conception of racism is basically entirely individualist. So, like, they'll just think, like, oh, like, you just fire the cop that killed the guy. And maybe, maybe there's, like, a couple other racist cops or something who are just extremely, like, KKK, members or something like that. Get rid of those guys, then you'll be fine. Like, all we have to do is have, like, the right president who's not racist, and everything will be fine, right? Like, that's really the issue. Like, it's just a few individual people who are racist. There are racist people, there are not racist people.
Right.
We just need to get rid of the racist people, and we'll be fine. what a socialist should be doing is they should be saying, no, it's not just a couple racist cops. It's not just, that our president is racist. We need to realize that the entire systemic structure of our society is constantly perpetuating, impoverishment of black communities, basically systemically creating an environment that breeds racism and breeds hatred of other minority groups, because that's what capitalism does inherently. It needs an underclass. I think somebody in the comments mentioned that. I mean, capitalism needs an underclass in order to survive, because it needs somebody that it can make to do the worst, most grueling, most degrading labor for the least amount of pay. And you see this in all capitalist societies. There's some group that is marginalized and cast off. And oftentimes they're not even black. They could be, any type of group. Like it could be like the Irish in Northern Ireland, or it could be, Italians or something like that. Like it doesn't even matter. Like they will find some sort of group to place their, anger and hatred towards and exploit them to the maximum. So, I mean, we have to you have to make people realize that it's not just if you elect Trump out of the White House and you replace him with, another Obama or something like that, it's not going to solve anything. It's not just a problem of just replacing bad people. We need to replace the entire system that causes it at the root.
Right. It's almost like a Lassallean argument, like, oh, the antagonisms can be resolved if just the right person is put in power, or the wrong person is removed from power. Where we're trying to say that the racism that we see in society is a direct consequence of the capitalist system. And I think, just to sort of close the stream out on a high note, there is a speech that Lenin gave, all about anti-Semitism in the movement. But I think it could just as easily apply towards any kind of discrimination, be it racism or sexism or LGBT phobia. So let's give this a listen, and we'll sort of have like a roundtable response, and then we will wrap up the stream.
I can't hear it. I'm not sure if you can hear it.
Yeah, it would probably be better if we could hear it. Let me start it over again.
Oh, there we go.
Когда проклятая царская монархия добивала свое последнее время, она старалась натравить темных рабочих и крестьян на евреев. Царская полиция в союзе с помещиками и капиталистами устраивала еврейские погромы. Ненависть измученных нуждой рабочих и крестьян помещики и капиталисты старались направить на евреев. И в других странах приходится видеть нередко, что капиталисты разжигают вражду к евреям, чтобы затарить глаза рабочих, чтобы открыть их взоры от настоящего врага трудящихся, от капитала. Вражда к евреям держится прочно только там, где кабала помещиков и капиталистов создала беспросветную темноту рабочих и крестьян. Только совсем темные, совсем забитые люди могут верить в лжи и клевете, распространяемой против евреев. Это остатки старого, крепостного времени, когда попы заставляли сбегать еретиков.
I think the sound cut out.
Oh man.
Oh, there we go.
Капиталисты стараются посеять и раздеть вражду между рабочими разной веры, разной нации, разной расы. На розни рабочих держится сила и власть капитала. Богатые евреи, как и богатые русские, как и богатые всех стран, в союзе друг с другом давят, гнетут, грабят, разъединяют рабочих. Позор проклятому царизму, мучившему и преследовавшему евреев. Позор всем, кто сеет вражду к евреям, кто сеет ненависть к другим нациям. Да здравствует братское доверие и боевой союз рабочих всех наций в борьбе за свержение капитала.
All right. So, yeah, he said a lot there. But one thing that stood out to me is he said, look, there are Jewish bourgeois and there are Jewish proletarians. Our enemies are the capitalists of every country, and our allies are the proletarians of every country, whether they're Jewish or not. And so the point that Lenin is trying to make here, among many points he made in that video, we'll put a link to it in the description, is that the bourgeois will try to divide the working class against themselves. They'll pit, white worker against black worker. They'll pit citizen worker against immigrant worker. And this is something that you see done here in the United States. They will say, beware of these illegal immigrants. Immigrant labor is taking your jobs. They said the same thing about black people with affirmative action. They said, beware of affirmative action. The black people are going to take all your jobs. It is an attempt for the bourgeois to divide the working class against themselves by inciting racial hatred. This is something, the racism in America is a direct product of capitalist propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool hearing Lenin actually talking. I feel like I rarely get to hear his voice, but yeah, he made a lot of really good points. I'm sure post Juche Nazbol or whatever is like, oh, look at Lenin, he's focusing on identity issues.
Yeah.
Oh, why doesn't he just focus on class? Oh my God. Yeah, I'm sure Lenin was just a triggered SJW liberal whose mind was just corrupted with liberalism. He didn't really care about, class struggle or anything, because he said, we need to protect Jewish proletarians and everything. Like,
why wasn't
it never ends?
Why wasn't he talking about the anti-Russian racism?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, totally. I mean, this stuff has been going on forever. Like, there've always been socialists, quote unquote, socialists on the left, or supposedly on the left, who are always seeking to just blame things on oppressed minorities and saying, oh, why are you guys defending them? Oh, I can't believe you guys are just a bunch of liberals. Like, if you look at like the 80s, the shit was going on in like the Communist Party of Britain, especially, was extremely homophobic, and they tried to denounce people who were fighting for gay rights as like liberal bourgeois, class traders and things like that, who are trying to divide the working class. This shit has been going on forever. There have been anti-Semitic people, anti-Semitic socialists. Like, I think in France, I was watching a video, they was talking about how in French they have like a saying that's like, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. And like, it's been going on like forever. Like, since like the late 1800s, there have been like people trying to blame problems on the Jews, like economic problems on the Jews, or economic problems on immigrants, or, anything like that. And it's ridiculous. And it's, like, right. Just like educate yourself and stop buying into like far right, extremely far right, virulent, disgusting talking points that are just alienating you to the vast majority of humanity. Anyway, I'm going to stop getting pissed off at this guy, but yeah. I mean, even Lenin, all right? You probably like Lenin. Listen to Lenin. He says, we should not be turning the working people against each other. Our enemies are not, among minority groups that are being oppressed. You're buying into literal czarist propaganda. Right. He's telling people, don't buy into that bullshit that's far right and does nothing. All right. Anyways, preaching to the choir, except for this one guy. So I'll shut up now.
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. if did you want that to be your closing statement, or did you want to, you know,
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I have to say.
yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say too. Like I said before, I will post a video taking meticulous care not to show anyone's faces or try to ID anybody, but I will post a video of the Memphis protests. Possibly in the future, we are going to have an interview with FVK talking about his experiences at the protest. So, yeah, I mean, we will come back and revisit this topic. It's very important to do this, and it's very important to keep giving updates and analysis on what's happening. So, with all that said, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. We hope that you found something educational about this stream, and we thank you very much for tuning in.
Yep. Have a good night, guys.